For your EAP assignment, you will have a couple of different criteria. You'll have a written portion, and then you will have the actual plan. In the written portion, there's a handful of elements you need to compare and contrast roles and responsibilities of emergency personnel, identify what an emergency action plan is, identify the various types of equipment that you need to use, and then you have to also cite everything in JAMA style. We will go over that. We have a couple days in class for you to work on this. And then you will develop a one page, maybe 2-page emergency action plan for a venue of your choice. So if we have time today, I will let you all kind of poke around and see if you find a park or find a sports complex that you want to do, that you can do that. Any questions on emergency action plan stuff? All right. It'll be a couple minutes before Dr. Scarno-Miller joins us. She's in a meeting before this, so I will let you know when she tries to hop in the Zoom. All right. All right, there we go.
All right, I'm gonna share that screen. All right, do you guys see the big slide screen or do you see my notes screen?
We got your slide screen.
Awesome, sounds good. All right, so I know I'm guest lecturing for you guys, but I always want to make sure that I'm very forthcoming. As I talked about, I am a consultant for KSI still. And I'm also an expert witness on legal cases related to catastrophic injury. So if somebody gets really hurt and they decide to sue somebody else, I get called on to help identify if somebody did something wrong. So I do get paid for that, which strongly recommend if you guys want to make a lot of money. That it's a good place to be. Obviously, I think that best practices should be adopted by all athletic trainers and all forms of policies and procedures, inclusive of an emergency action plan. So some background information. So before 2020, if you heard this talk, you would hear me say that there's 4 H's that result in the most amount of deaths in high school and college and youth sports. And those are heat, heart, head, and hemoglobin. So sudden cardiac arrest, traumatic head injuries, exertional heat stroke, and something called ECAST, exertional collapse associated with sickle cell trait. And that's basically when you have sickle cell trait and not the full-blown disease. So if you exert yourself too hard, then your red blood cells can turn into that moon shape, and it kind of creates a backlog. In 2021, a new abstract was published by Dr. Kristen Kucera out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And what we're seeing now is that sickle cell trait really isn't accounting for most deaths at all anymore. There's been some great policy changes that have really influenced patient outcomes, and therefore most athletes are not dying from sickle cell trait anymore. So that leaves heart, head, and heat stroke as our top causes of sudden death in sport. So I'm sure most of you haven't lived under a rock and you've heard about the Damar Hamlin situation. Just give me like a brief nod if you have. Okay, I see at least one nod. So we got one person who's heard of that. So Damar Hamlin is a Buffalo Bill, excuse me. And he had a cardiac arrest on Monday Night Football in January 2023. The athletic trainers knew exactly what was happening, got an AED on him. They were able to shock him an undetermined amount of times, and they brought him back. So it is the #1 cause of death, far and above everything else. So this is the one that we're always concerned about. Head injuries are usually traumatic in nature. So somebody goes head on head with somebody, head on pole, head on body, can cause some type of brain bleed or fracture. So those are the big scary things we talk about. Concussions don't kill people. So don't think traumatic head injuries and think that this is only concussions, because it's actually not concussions at all. This is your brain bleeds, your skull fractures, all those types of other scary things. And then exertional heat stroke is actually 100% survivable with proper recognition and care, but yet it remains to account for approximately 11% of all deaths in sport. So it's really interesting that we still continue to see these deaths occurring, and that these deaths are occurring in large numbers, because there's things that we can do to try to prevent them, or prevent the death and prevent some of them. Catastrophic injuries are things that happen that are really bad, but might not be fatal. So you can survive from a cardiac arrest. You can survive from a traumatic head injury. Spinal cord injuries actually make up 1/5 of all catastrophic non-fatal injuries. So it's really important that although we continue to talk about the top 3 causes of sudden death in sport, we need to be very cognizant of spinal cord injuries, because we need to make sure that we are addressing these as well. Because some might argue that a patient surviving from a catastrophic injury with a spinal cord injury who might be paralyzed the rest of their life, they might argue that it might be a similar negative consequence to sport as death. So we're seeing participation numbers continue to rise, and it's actually bouncing back to pre-pandemic levels right now in the high school setting. So high school setting, we were approximately 7.9 million athletes participating in sports in 2020. That dropped down to about 7.7, 7.6 in 2021. And then the 2022 data came back about 7.95 million. So now we're continuing to see patients participating in sport again, which means that they have a risk of getting hurt. So, if somebody's playing sports, they're probably going to get hurt, which is why athletic trainers are important to begin with. But it's also important that we talk about how athletic trainers, coaches, athletic directors, administrators, you guys, everybody be involved in the development of policies and procedures and emergency action plans to help, mitigate these things from happening. So let me get into some key definitions, which usually puts me on a soapbox for a second here, so I apologize. So there's a big difference between an emergency action plan and a policy and procedure. So an emergency action plan is a concrete written document to help us identify how any type of response to an emergency situation. So if somebody collapses from a cardiac arrest, or they collapse because they have a fractured femur, your response is going to be essentially the same. Somebody is going to go to the athlete and identify if it is a catastrophic injury, needing the EAP to be activated. Somebody is going to get your emergency equipment for you, which is going to vary based on the condition, what that is. Somebody is going to call 911. Somebody is going to do field management. Somebody's going to open the gate. Somebody's going to direct EMS. Somebody's going with the patient to the hospital. Somebody is going to document the whole thing. So that emergency action plan is for any type of injury in a pre-hospital setting. So that's different than policies and procedures, because policies and procedures will be condition specific. So this means exertional heat stroke is a condition. So how you respond to an exertional heat stroke is going to be generally the same. However, the in-depth diagnostic and treatment of that heat stroke is going to be different than how you respond to a sudden cardiac arrest. I think the difference for this comes because there has been good research done on the effectiveness and efficacy of an emergency action plan as it relates to sudden cardiac arrest. Because if 64% of our deaths are attributed to sudden cardiac arrest, it's really easy for my colleagues who are researchers to evaluate the effectiveness of an emergency action plan in that circumstance, because there's the most amount of those types of injuries. So I think some people think that because most of the research has been done there, then an emergency action plan should be for all types of catastrophic injuries, like in depth. You need to have an EAP for this and that and that. And that's where, we see a lot of people get their terminology confused. So on the Best Place Known to Mankind, Facebook, people talk about their HEAT EAP all the time. And it drives me up a wall because it would be their HEAT policy and procedure, not their HEAT EAP. Or it might just be an EAP, not HEAT specific. So using terminology that is correct is really important in this circumstance. I'm going to stop there, and I just want to make sure that that's in line with what you guys have heard and see if you have any questions before I go into the rest of this.
Yes, no, maybe. Crickets.
All right, Dr. Barnhart, are you good with those definitions then?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, I'll continue. All right. So sometimes I think it's easy to show this in a conceptualized manner. So there's this book that's been published called Checklist Manifesto. And it was probably published in like 1972 or something crazy like that, right? So in this book, it talks about how surgery was seeing a lot of surgical errors resulting in negative patient outcomes. Negative patient outcomes are things such as death, long-term disability, infection, incorrect procedures done, whatever it might be. And so in the book, they talk about how they implemented checklists first and foremost on airplanes. So airplanes, start getting really integrated into society in like the early 1900s or so, but they had a lot of crashes too. So when they have a lot of crashes in airplanes, they start thinking, okay, well, people just aren't checking things that they need to be checking. So they put this checklist in place in airplanes and they say, all right, that's working. So then surgery started being like, okay, well, if this checklist thing is working to reduce the amount of airplane crashes, then maybe we need to have a checklist for surgery. So they have a pre-surgical checklist that they fill out now for every single surgery all the time. They have a nurse who runs through it. The surgeon says yes, no, yes, no. They confirm name. They confirm where they're, working, like left knee, right knee, whatever it might be. And then there's been research done on this now that has shown that when you have a checklist, it should be short and sweet and to the point, and it should actually be 10 words or less per bullet. And that's when those checklists are most effective. So during my graduate work, I was like, well, an emergency action plan is a checklist. And it doesn't matter if I'm at WVU or if I'm at your high school, because the checklist is going to be essentially the same. The difference is going to be that I'm calling 911 versus you're calling 911, or the address, or who I have to contact, all this stuff, right? So we put together this checklist that says, here's the steps I'm going to run through. So this can be more detailed than just what it is right up here, but this is essentially the portion of your EAP that is your response. So check the scene, identify the severity, have somebody call 911, give information, give emergency care. Somebody goes to get relevant emergency equipment, crowd control, etc. So 4 and 5 in the middle here, these are the ones that are dictated by your policies and procedures. So you're going to perform emergency care no matter what. But if it's a femur fracture, then you need to be talking about getting a tourniquet, potentially, if it's an open femur fracture through the femoral artery, right? Whereas if you are having somebody who's having a mental health crisis, this is going to be a different response than grabbing a tourniquet, right? You're going to have different de-escalation considerations that you might be putting into place. Getting emergency equipment is exactly the same thing, right? So if you need a tourniquet, somebody's going to go get a tourniquet. But if you're having a mental health crisis, there might not be any equipment that you need to go get. There's just things that you need to be doing in that moment to help your patient. So emergency planning is really the combination of both of these things, emergency action plans and policies and procedures. So these policies and procedures can be written for all types of catastrophic injuries. On the screen, I think, are the top 10 causes of sudden death in sport. So after the 4 that we've talked about, lightning, spinal cord, internal injuries, asthma, anaphylaxis, and hyponatremia are on there. Excuse me. All right. This is a seltzer, just to let you know. Somebody one time thought that it was like a hard seltzer. No, it's just a bubbly. It's just a strawberry bubbly. So the National Athletic Trainers Association is the overall advocacy body for athletic trainers. I should say advocacy body for athletic trainers. And in what they do is they try to put out these position statements to help athletic trainers synthesize the evidence on a certain topic so that they can provide improved care for their patients. In 2002, the NATA published a position statement on emergency planning in athletics. So this was on emergency action plans for athletics. And so it's 2023, so 21 years later, we are now at a point where we're like, yeah, we should update this. And I'm just going to be very honest with you guys. There's been a lot more research to support additional components that should be in the emergency action plan. But it's also really hard to do really good research on emergency action plans. There's something called the Institutional Review Board, and the IRB doesn't really want us to hurt patients to see if an EAP is going to be effective. So we need to do a lot of field research with emergency action plans to see if it's working or not, which again is why sudden cardiac arrest has the most literature on it. So given that this was published in 2002, you would think that most high schools have an emergency action plan. Well, we found in 2019 that 90% of athletic trainers working in a high school setting, and this was a sample of about 1,300 athletic trainers, had an emergency action plan. They said, yes, I have a written emergency action plan. So then we were like, all right, well, let's look at policies and procedures because maybe it's better. So we found 69% had a heat policy, 75% had a lightning policy. We basically found that it wasn't better and that emergency action plans were kind of the bread and butter, which was good, but was also something that we were like, okay, how do we help athletic trainers adopt better best practices? So comprehensive adoption means that we look at those published best practice documents. So we're kind of looking through it and we're pulling out the various components that we think need to be in an emergency action plan. So for an emergency action plan, we'd be looking at that 2002 position statement saying, okay, this has been published. It has these different recommendations. How do I integrate this into my best practice? Well, then you look at those different components and you see, okay, here's the various components that I need to include in my emergency action plan. So as an athletic trainer, we can use these position statements to guide whether or not we are doing everything we need to do to provide a safe environment for our patients. Well, so then we studied that part and we found that only 10% of athletic trainers had a comprehensive emergency action plan. And it was all really interesting and we were all really disheartened to find this, but it really sparked us to be very vigilant about wanting to improve emergency action plan adoption. So that's why, we've been really pushing the topic of emergency action plans versus policies and procedures. And hopefully this, 11 minutes to this point has been helpful to show you guys, the importance of an emergency action plan and why we need it. So to show you a little bit in depth, I don't want to go in depth here, so please forgive me if I go quickly through this, but at least it's being recorded for the other part of your class and you guys can go back to this. But a policy and procedure is a critical component of a risk management plan. Has clear expectations, which is the policy statement, followed by procedures that help you to implement the policy. It's really a roadmap. It says, okay, if Johnny gets hurt, and has a traumatic head injury, here's how our initial response is going to be, and here's how we're going to continue to monitor. So this is an example of a policy and procedure on the KSI website. So if you go to ksi.uconn.edu, it's supposed to be under prevention, sports medicine policies and procedures, and you're supposed to be able to see it there. The KSI website is undergoing some massive changes right now. So their webpage like looks really weird. So if you have trouble finding it, let me know. But you'll see that there's a purpose to the policy. There's a policy statement, so prevention, monitoring, and treatment of exertional heat illnesses, that the policy applies to all staff members of, let's say, the high school. It gives definitions because not everybody knows what WBGT means or heat acclimatization. And then it goes into the various procedures. So here's how we're going to prevent. Here's how we're doing environmental monitoring. All of that jazz. So if you wanted to, and the purpose of this is it's posted on the KSI website as a Word doc so that anybody who wants to develop a heat policy can go on there and see this Word doc and then revise it. Now, the important pieces of this are that you have to modify the bolded portions of the policy to make it specific to your school and what you want to be doing at your school. So it's a good template document, and it shows you the entire policy and procedure from start to finish. So now, the main reason that we're talking today is the emergency action plan. So in the 2002 position statement, it has, we'll call it 14 components that should be in an emergency action plan. And so what we did is we created some type of checklist, and I can send you the publication that has the finalized checklist. Okay, finalized as of that publication checklist. We've revised it again since then, but it's not published yet. On all of the components that need to be in here. So it needs to be developed and coordinated with internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, distributed and reviewed by staff members annually, rehearsed annually, updated annually, provides responsibilities for different people, identify the location of on-site equipment, list contact information for EMS, documentation that should occur after. This one is the confusing one, which we have taken out as of the newest version of this document. So the position statement says you should include athletic trainers in your EAP. And the position statement's written for athletic trainers. So it's just a really weird statement, but basically make sure you have access to some type of healthcare professional. Each venue should have one, which I think points to the project that you guys are doing, is you're choosing, I believe, a public venue.
Park area venue of some kind.
Yep. So that's the venue specific part, right? Because everywhere has different addresses and different access and egress points. The posting of the EAP, maintenance of emergency equipment, and then approval. So let me just go into some of these components here. Dr. Barnhart, this goes until 12 o'clock Eastern,
Yes.
right?
You're 3 hours ahead of me. Yes.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. I want to make sure I wasn't messing up on my timing for you. All right. All right, so here's the components. So who's responsible for creating the emergency action plan? This is going to vary based on institutions, because if you don't have access to an athletic trainer, then it might be that the athletic director, coaches, or somebody else might be responsible for developing it. This person is also kind of our EAP coordinator, if you want to call them. So they are the person who's responsible for getting external feedback, internal feedback, reviewing and documenting changes, updating, etc. It's also important that we identify the emergency response. Oh my gosh. The emergency personnel in charge of different types of things. So athletic trainer, coach, who is certified in what, who is going to help with different types of injuries. Sports medicine team. You might have a certified athletic trainer. In California, you might not have a certified athletic trainer. team physician, school nurse, local EMT. So it's important to identify what your emergency team would look like, right? So if you have an athletic trainer, they might be more qualified to respond to a catastrophic injury than a team physician. So sometimes team physicians just don't have the emergency care background that we do, even if they're an emergency medicine doc, because they might have the hospital setting covered, but not the pre-hospital setting. So it's important to have these conversations with your different stakeholders to identify who should be doing what, when, and why. This is another example of that. So emergency telephone numbers. When I first read the position statement a while ago, I was really confused because it said contact information for EMS. I'm like, well, you just call 911. But then I learned, and this was back in like, I don't know, 2014, that a lot of schools might not call 911. They might call their local campus security because they might get a faster response time than if they call 911. So knowing the different types of emergency telephone numbers is really important for your own school and your own venue to know how are people going to call for help and what number is going to get them there the fastest. A contact tree is also an important thing to consider. You can see that this example for this school has a life-threatening condition and they call 911, they provide care, and they provide care until EMS arrives. Here it says get the AED, but this would be get the AED or any type of emergency equipment. If it's non-threatening, call the athletic trainer first and then provide care. So always considering what to do if there's an athletic trainer versus not an athletic trainer. So if the athletic trainer is not on scene, it is typically best to call 911 first and then call the athletic trainer. Because we need to get EMS there as fast as possible, depending on the situation. Now, if I know that the athletic trainer is just at the field next to me, then I might call that athletic trainer first because I know that they're going to get there in like 35 seconds. But if I know that they are on the complete other side of the school, then I'm going to call 911. I'm going to have somebody else call the athletic trainer. But identifying how this is going to work for your field or your venue is also really important.
Dr. Scarno Miller, unfortunately, we have a fire drill right now.
The DRC director, 10 minutes.
Lovely.
Okay.
Oh.
Fire drill, please evacuate.
We will be back in around 10-ish minutes.
Okay,
That's
no
okay.
problem.
All right. There we go. We're back. So
All right. So we got about 15 minutes.
yep.
Let me,
And we can, if you need to go a little bit longer, you can.
okay, no worries about it. No worries at all. All right. So let's pick up here with emergency equipment then. So, emergency equipment, like we said, is not just the AED, it's any type of catastrophic injury emergency equipment. Asthma.
We cannot see your shared screen.
Oh, well, that's a problem. That's not gonna work then. Hold on. Okay. How about now?
And there we go. Perfect.
All right. Well, all right. Emergency equipment is important and you should have it. Make sure that all of your venues, you know exactly where the equipment is. It doesn't have to be on scene, although it's obviously preferred for it to be. Here's some examples of different things that you want to consider. Obviously, considering the top causes of sport-related death is important when thinking about emergency equipment, but it goes way beyond that. A first aid kit, a stop the bleed kit, Narcan, all important things to consider for emergency equipment. This is the only time that I actually think that pictures are good. I am not somebody who advocates for a lot of pictures in emergency action plans. I think it muddies the waters. And I think that a lot of people get really caught up in the aesthetics. So if you have a confusing venue, if you have a venue where it's not really straightforward where EMS access would be, I think having some pictures is helpful. But when you're calling 911, they can't see the picture that you're talking about. So if you have a picture, I always suggest having text that describes the picture above it or below it. So you guys know, like alt text for people who might be vision impaired. Having alt text for the individual providing the directions to the facility is going to be helpful to help describe that picture. Having pictures of emergency equipment can be helpful, especially if you have a lot of different doors and areas to go inside of a school. So you'll see that this was my school. We had 2 floors, just like a few rooms shown here. Obviously, the school was much bigger than this, but you can see that we wanted to make sure everybody knew exactly where the AED was in relevance to these different places. All right. So then we go into the actual plan, or the response, we should say. And as a reminder, this is your kind of general response developed based off of a checklist thought process. So when do we activate an EAP? There's a lot of different reasons that we can activate an EAP. It can be a heat illness, it can be a cardiac arrest, it can be loss of consciousness. It might be that you're not sure if it's a catastrophic injury or not, because if you're not sure, it's better to activate the EAP than to not activate it. We have to know our roles going into this. We talked about chain of command briefly, but we also have to know how EMS is going to respond when they get there. If it's a cardiac arrest, we probably want them to stay in play for a couple of minutes and see if they can get that AED on and get a rhythm back if we were not able to. Sometimes their AEDs are much more advanced and can do more than our sideline AEDs. So we might want them to stay in play for a little bit, and then we need them to load and go. For heat stroke, we always want them to stay in play until we get core body temperature down under 102 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's a TBI, we want them to load and go as soon as possible. So really making sure that we're working with EMS to make sure that they know what we need them to do in certain circumstances, especially because the scope of practice is different for different healthcare professionals. So if we have a physician on scene, they can do way more in terms of emergency care than we can sometimes if they have that access or ability in the pre-hospital setting. Sometimes EMS can do more than we can. Sometimes there's just a difference in things that we can do. So if you guys become an athletic trainer, you're a certified athletic trainer, our current best practice documents say that equipment or that we should be putting somebody with a C-spine injury onto a hard long board, which is a really long spine board that's hard, and you like lift them onto it. Whereas EMS literature says, no, we need to have them on a soft stretcher because that allows for the contours of the body and it's more advanced. And so they've advanced into that newest best practice, whereas athletic training has not. Athletic training has advanced into using rectal temperature for exertional heat stroke diagnosis. I would say probably half, if not 60% of EMS are on board with rectal temperature now and understand that it's the newest best practice, but we still have a long way of going to educate them. So just making sure that everybody's on the same page so that when we're responding to an injury, it is coordinated care. Equipment removal, do we need to do it? Do we not need to? Direct EMS to the scene. I'm sorry, this got cut off on the bottom, my bad. Basically, what information are you going to give EMS when they come? So now here's a picture of my school and what our emergency action plan looks like. So you can see here that we would have EMS access from Asylum Street. They'd come down, come through the parking lot in the front of the school, go around to the side of the building, and you would see that I had all of my exit signs marked out here. what we decided was that this front exit sign here was the best egress route because we had spectators that were kind of near the rest of the exit routes. So although some of them might be quicker without having spectators there, we almost always had spectators at these different events that we would have. So therefore we chose EMS parking to be at the southwest corner, whatever this ended up being, of the school. And like I said, putting pictures in might be helpful if you have, like you see here, many different access and egress routes. But to describe this picture to somebody would be really helpful to have alt text there describing it for them, like for the phone. What is your mode of communication? So if I'm calling from our WVU Shell athletic training room, I need to call from a landline because we don't have good cell service down there. Whereas if I'm calling from our football field, then I can use my cell phone. If I'm calling from our football field this Saturday when WVU plays Pitt, which is a huge game, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people in town for that. It might be the best bet to call 911 on a landline because you don't know if cell service is going to be jammed. After you've contacted EMS, who do you contact next? Do you have to call their parents? Do you have to call your athletic director? What has to happen then? And then making sure that you're debriefing this plan, an incident report, whatever it might be. Distribution. This should happen every single year, sometimes multiple times a year if you have changes. You should be able to distribute the EAP to different stakeholders. They should have a copy of it. They should be able to review it. They should be able to ask you questions. You should have it posted at different venues so that everybody knows where it is and what they're going to do if there's an emergency. Sometimes you might have trouble posting it at the venue. So if one of you is choosing the public park, then usually public parks don't want an emergency action plan for a high school posted there because your EAP might be different than somebody else's EAP based on resources and a bunch of different things. So you can think about putting it in a discrete area, or the way that I did it is I had made sure that all of my coaches had med kits. And so this is actually a tackle box made into a med kit. You know, we just get creative. And I Velcroed the emergency action plan into the med kit so that if there was an injury, my coaches could rip off the EAP, have it in front of them, and they could read through it. And we lost a lot of them. So I put our name on it. Don't need to do that. All right. So the last thing that I want to really talk about here is rehearsal strategies and approval. So making sure that everybody is rehearsing the EAP. There's a thought process here called calm is contagious. So if I respond to an injury and I am frantic and I am screaming and I'm like, oh my God, I don't know what to do, then everybody around me is going to be screaming and not knowing what to do. But if I respond to the injury and I am calm and I'm cool and I'm collected, then everybody else can think clearly and we can make sure we're providing the best care to our patient. So importantly with that is rehearsing it, because if you keep doing things over and over again, then you can feel really comfortable with whatever's about to happen. So rehearsing it is important, and making sure that people approve of the emergency action plan is also important. So working through who needs to approve it, when they need to approve it, and who has ultimate authority here is really important pieces. So I have a couple of examples. Before I do that, do you guys have any questions about the components of an emergency action plan? Or can somebody even just verify if any of this made sense?
We got a couple nods and shakes that I think that we all get it. Yes. All right.
All right. So, let me show you an example of a good one. So this emergency action plan is from the state of Kentucky. I'm not going to go into why I have it, but I'll just let you know that it's not illegal that I have it, or illegal that I show you because this is a public document that's required by their state law. So they actually have a policy and procedure manual for sports medicine and athletics. This is Madison Central High School. You can see this school has a principal, an athletic director, and an athletic trainer. And then they actually have a table of contents, and this is where their emergency action plan is. It starts on page 3. So the rest of this would not be part of the emergency action plan, except for 15 to 18. I'm going to guess that's their venue specific portion. So let's go to page 3, which is right here. Nope, it's not right there. Where is it? Oh yeah, it is. Okay, it starts right here. So talking about what their emergency action plan is, how it works, the personnel included in it. They have equipment that they talk about, communications. You guys can still see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Transportation, how they're going to get somebody from point A to point B. Then they have their venue addresses here, which was really great. They have different types of emergency care facilities, how they're going to document. And then let's go down and see if I'm right. Yep. So this is their venue specific emergency action plan. But it doesn't have their address in here. So this would need to have their address in here that they could post somewhere. And so when I was looking through, we have like a little checklist that we see which emergency action plans are good and not good. I read this as Madison, and I just clicked on Madison Central and I opened it, and this is what I got. And I was like, there's no way that my master's students think that this is a good emergency action plan, because this one does not have anything other than the gymnasium. So we're going to make an assumption that they have more venues than just a gymnasium. It doesn't talk about what the roles and responsibilities are, like who's doing what down here. It has a checklist. It does have an address. It has some directions, but not really. This does not talk about review and rehearsal, distribution. It doesn't talk about internal and external coordination. It doesn't talk about posting it, debriefing, documentation. I think I've said about 7 times. So when I first read this, I thought I needed to have an intervention with my own students and find out why we thought this was a good one, but it wasn't. It was this one that was a good one. And then this one was really bad. So this one says you're calling this number for ambulance, which was good, I guess. But then it says call 911. So it's like, okay, so which one am I calling? Am I calling ambulance or am I calling 911? I'm going to go with 911. It talks briefly about your 4-digit plan here, but doesn't really provide who's calling who, when they're calling, doesn't talk about review, distribute, rehearsal, anything like that. All right, I'm going to leave it there because you guys are about to get out of class. What questions do we have? Somebody's got to ask me one question before you're allowed to leave the classroom.
I will have one question for you because this is one question I have gotten, Dr. Scarno. Is what is the history behind having the like nearby hospitals on the emergency action plan?
I have no idea, and it will not be in the 24 position statement. I don't get it. Like what's the point of that, especially in the high school setting, right? So I can see it from my collegiate athletics. So for WVU, I'm in the School of Medicine, which is connected to the hospital, which is 50 yards from our football stadium. So I can appreciate that maybe our head athletic trainer or our head doc might need to call the ED and be like, hey, you know, Jadon is coming in with this, and this. We did this all on scene. We told EMS, but I want to make sure that you know too, like he's going to be there in 43 seconds. I can see that, but from a high school perspective, like I can't think of many situations for when you might need to call the ambulance. Okay, and I should backtrack, right? So this position statement is about to go through a 29-person peer review process. So although I tell you I don't want it in the final document, peer review might tell me otherwise. So don't yell at me in 2024 if it comes out and it says something like that, because peer review process, you know, I don't know if you know how it is, but it can be a pain. I can't figure it out, and our author team can't figure it out either. Sorry, that doesn't help, but that's your answer.
Matt, what do you got? Can you briefly summarize the difference between an emergency action plan and policy and procedures again?
Absolutely. And I'll do it briefly like you asked. An emergency action plan is written to respond to any type of catastrophic injury. So if you have somebody who has a cardiac arrest, has a fractured femur, having a mental health crisis, or got in a fight and they have a lot of catastrophic injuries, your response is going to be the same for all of those. The policies and procedures is going to dictate that specific evaluation process and that specific treatment process, and probably prevention if it could have been prevented. So policies and procedures are going in depth in that one condition. So I'm going to prevent heat stroke by doing heat acclimatization, hydration procedures, WBGT, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to evaluate by taking a rectal temp and signs and symptoms. I'm going to treat by doing this, and this. It's going to be more in depth. So your EAP is how I respond to anything that happens at this venue, which is all going to be somewhat similar. And then certain pieces are dictated by your policies and procedures.
Saw someone else have one. That was just the one. All right. Anything else before I let Dr. Scarno Miller go? Scarnia Miller.
You can share my email with them too if they are too scared to ask a question right now.
Yeah. Next class, we will pick I will help you pick your venues. This will be up on Canvas later today if you want to review it. Thanks, everyone. Get out of here.